So the first one for all panelists is the usual one we've been asked, which is why maps? But you've been giving this answer to me, so I would add also maybe why maps at different scales, and which is because you've all been dealing with this smooth, seamless transitions, and I would add something there too, just to make it a bit more, spicy. Is this moving with scales really smooth, or is it a bit a lie that sometimes we build? So I'm curious about your opinion on this.
Okay, I'll try and think of something very quickly. Well, why maps? I first became interested in, weirdly, text on maps when I was an undergraduate because I was looking for maps that contained references to the Celtic Sea. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just go to the map library and surely they'll be able to point me in the right direction, or I'll be able to search in the catalog. Right? And that was my first introduction to what isn't cataloged. And of course, when it is, things like, well, mentioning something on a map isn't there. Anyhow, that was a very early map kind of experience for me, which clearly stuck with me. But the scale issue, I think, is really interesting. I'm trained as an 18th century historian of France. And I'm used to working with maps that are much less, accurate, or maps of very different kinds than the 19th century Ordnance Survey maps. And so it's been such a weirdly strange experience to all of a sudden have access to information about a historical time and place that at multiple scales. And really kind of within the 19th century, we have a couple of different timestamps with OS stuff alone, not to speak about other countries. And I feel so overwhelmed by all this information that it's a weird experience. So the overwhelming sense of how we navigate through both the physical collections which are being digitized and the representations of the kind of the Earth as we are experiencing it. And of course, that is now historical data too, right? We have historical imagery going back multiple decades now. It's so overwhelming, but that's also what's exciting about it. So yeah, I don't know. Scale is exciting. Yeah.
Okay, for me, I think probably a story very similar to many people in the room. I found a road atlas as a way of exploring the world before I could. I have very strong memories of my childhood home. I probably was 5 or 6 with an old, very brown 1970s AA road atlas of the United Kingdom. And mentally, I would go exploring all these places that ultimately one day I would do. But at the time I thought, well, I'm never going to go to Scotland. It looks amazing on this map. It's very exciting. I became a geographer at the time when people were getting into digital mapping. At university, I taught the lecturers how to do computing, and that kind of ended up to where I am today. The scale question is a really interesting one. It's, in many ways, it's something we've always tried to fight against, because scale is an abstract concept, of course, but because maps have been tools that have been used for measurement, scale was really important. And it also manages in a very convenient way how you represent the world, how you deal with abstraction at different levels, depending upon the thematic content you are interested in. So it's really hard to get away from scale. And I don't think we're ever going to achieve it. I think it's always going to be there.
And Sarah?
I came to maps because I was a former maritime archaeologist, so I used to dig up shipwrecks. And so you can imagine how vital mapping is and was to those processes of both historical knowledge and discovery. So maps were very critical there. And why scale is important is because it allows us, in a narrative sense, to reveal more than just what the naked eye can see. That it also provides the opportunity for an emergent narrative within a particular depiction of the world. And that's what intrigues me about maps, and how we might use them within a narrative landscape.
What's your go-to map platform, or sort of go-to? Well, maybe it's Google, but
Not always. No, not
He's
always.
just told us not to use it.
that's
So,
true. It's
yeah.
true. We've had this. So what's
You haven't recorded this, have you? No.
It's being recorded. Yes, very dangerous. I know. It's kind of evangelist.
So what maps do I use? Well, I do use Google Maps. I have to say that, obviously. And I do use Apple Maps probably 30 or 40% of the time. And I always have to keep an eye on, on the two. Apple Maps is marvelous product now, definitely equivalent to Google Maps. So I think what's interesting is probably we all take a maps application in our pocket for granted. It's something we probably all use every day for various things. And again, I'm obviously not going to deny the value and the opportunity that gives us. But I said, don't be one of those people that just walks down the road with a map in front of them, not looking what's going on around you. Use it because you won't be lost, but don't use it to guide you all the time.
What's your approach to maps as you use them? Are you very critical as an historian? Do you have a sort of more?
Wow. Yeah. Well, it feels a bit like propaganda. Yes. What do I? But actually, what's been really an exciting development that comes out, of course, of these many decades of thinking about how we present geospatial information online is, new platforms like Felt mapping. I use it all the time in my teaching. I use it all the time just in workshops, right? Like throw up data. It's so easy. It's interactive. I wish it didn't cost money now, but it does. It's things that we think are free are not actually free. And yeah, that's something to we have to contend with. It's reality. But I think that's the thing is it's just so easy to play around with geospatial data now. And historians of maps and mapping argue about what is a map and, what's not a map, and that's all fine. But actually, I think this really expansive sense of what can be a map is really exciting and gets people interested in thinking spatially and working with different kinds of geospatial data. So I'm not really, I'm not interested in arguing about what it is, because I think it's the argument that gets people excited about coming to events like this.
Absolutely. See, Sarah is back, I think. We had some problems on our side. So we can go back to the initial question. I felt bad it just got truncated, which was why maps, and maybe something about scale they were discussing here. Thank you, Sarah. Sorry about the connection issues.
Fantastic. So I just to recap, I was originally a maritime archaeologist, so obsessed with maps actually, and navigation, and also immersion actually, and the mapping of abstract data on a seabed, for instance, through various processes, photogrammetry, etc. So that's one kind of mapping. And why scale is so intriguing is because it reveals more than the naked eye can see. And it gives us the opportunity for multi-layered narratives, which is really fabulous if you're talking about bringing mapping into the public domain. That you have these emergent stories. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's a question that was addressed to you, so we can start from you from this one and then expand. I think it's a very interesting one, which was about how the archives, starting from the archives and from this collection. Here it's framed from the public as how do they contribute to the creation of deep mapping? But I would maybe expand it already, the question a bit, by saying how are archives, and in a broader way, the data we're receiving, like satellite data, everything which has been curated by third parties or institutions, how do they contribute, or I would even say bind and influence our activity? And what's your experience around it as you're working on deep mapping yourself, Sarah?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but certainly multiple sources of data merge in these processes. And when you're working with archives now, it's a combination of both machine learning techniques when you don't have metadata, and metadata, the stuff of experts. And it's that merger that provides this extraordinary terrain on which we can reform our understanding and also access to these archival materials. And that's where the laboratory works a lot. We have 200,000 hours of digitized video from 4 major collections to precisely mine them and extract the vectors from them to deal with spatial, temporal, social, emotive, and affective vectors contained within the images. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's definitely a merger of technique.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You want to say something on the Wenwich archives, or?
I think the work
Katherine,
the work that Catherine's doing is absolutely vital, fabulous. I mean, I think the bit that we are missing, and it's because as geospatial folks, we're quite lazy. We don't do metadata particularly well. So filling the gaps of actually saying this is the content on this particular map sheet, on this particular series, is such an important activity, because there's so much knowledge on those maps within those archives that we don't really know is there yet, because we've not been able to process it. And I think machine learning is going to play an important part in extracting that knowledge. The challenge is going to be in terms of, and I think this is Katherine hinted at this, is making sure that we can keep access to that data in this modern world of machine learning, large language models, licensing restrictions. It's a complicated area, but there's the expertise.
Well, that's very kind. Yeah, I think there are a lot of licensing issues, and even when material is ostensibly has a license that permits its use, getting access to things can be difficult because institutions know those collections have commercial value. And that is a very difficult path to walk. Institutions are making difficult decisions because they have, as we all know, no money. And so they're kind of forced into a corner when thinking about the value of their collections, which is really not where they would want to be, right? So I just want to emphasize it's not it's not that they're trying to withhold data. And so that is something that as a society and as, you know, and at a kind of state level, we need to, and international level, we need to address. But I think the issue, if I can be a bit polemical, this issue of thinking about scale, the relationship between collections, is not just about saying we need to kind of maintain context and think about metadata, but it's also thinking about the language that we use when we're talking about what are we doing with historical data and linking it up with other geospatial data. And so I often introduce the idea of sort of stopping using the language of mining and extraction when we're talking about with historical maps, because that's a really sort of extractive, right, kind of idea of how we're interacting with these stuff. We're kind of taking true information away from maps and then using it in connection with other stuff. And I think, you know, I hope the work that I showed you today shows that there is a lot we can do with machine learning. There's a lot of really exciting things we can do with computer vision, but we have to be quite careful about those choices that we're making. And I think that kind of thinking about what we're doing not as extraction can actually be a helpful push, right? To be a bit more creative, to be sort of responsible users of historical materials as we try to do really cool and significant things with geospatial data from all different periods.
Yeah. I was thinking in that respect also, there's a process here where we move from extraction to an active way, a cooperative way within people in the field. How do you feel? There's still a lot to do potentially, but I'm curious about your opinion when it comes to involving people that are not in the workshop of our institutions, but are what we call the public, but actually a wide set of users and interested parties that participate. What's your experience around that? Because we see the data now being populated by a lot of people in different ways. I can see that in museums and so on. But also, is that the most we can do? Have you been thinking about ways in which in the future we can expand the cooperation, maybe through these pocket maps that are all connected and so on? So I'm very curious. Maybe Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly true today. We are all cartographers. You know, we are all, whether we realize it or not, whether it's implicit or explicit, we are creating geospatial content. We are doing that sometimes explicitly. Projects like OpenStreetMap and crowdsourcing focused areas are an example of that. And there's a huge humanitarian effort to map parts of the world that the commercial companies haven't mapped and are not going to. Then there's the data collection that happens by us just living our day-to-day lives. You know, the small percentage of you, probably less than 10%, who supply your location information anonymously to the likes of Google and Apple, making the road networks more efficient because you're providing content that can be used to give in real time speed conditions on any particular section of road. That's a radical shift. You know, real-time maps are a real thing now. You know, if you can see a map being updated once every 20 seconds when it comes to traffic conditions, that only happens by user contributions. That's the only mechanism by which that works. I think we can probably do a better job of explaining how that works and giving people greater awareness of it, and also pointing out the potential unintended consequences of doing that. And there are all sorts of ethical issues associated with that. But it's here today. We are all cartographers.
But thinking maybe, Sarah, you want to say something? Because your work has been, there's a public dimension, and I was curious if in your experience of deep mapping and working on this extended idea of mapping that you seem to have curated, if there's a more you are already planning to do where it involves the public?
So the systems that we're building are ones that are co-evolutionary in terms of narrative. So the role of the public is to unfold that narrative in any way they want to. So as they navigate or as they recombine or as they travel, they are emerging a unique narrative to them. And that's what these systems are destined for. And I would say that that's where the public and the big effort of technology are conjoined. And the future of participatory works in museums are really crucial for this understanding of inclusive dialogue and so on and so forth. I'm just building a project for the World Expo in Osaka. And this conjoins a database of scientific knowledge from 2,100 scientists with a generative AI engine where the public are in the middle, transforming how that data and all the prompt engineering. So we use a lot of large language models and generative AI to conjoin this database of science and the narratives that it contains with a series of parameters that the visitors manipulate to produce an image of the future in 5, 10, or 25 years into the future. So it's about trying to engage public in advanced scientific topics, which are often considered with some distrust by the public, the mass public. And these are strategies for trying to be inclusive in these different discourses in society.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you for your patience with the connection. With still some minutes, so I think another interesting point that we could cover, that we're talking about scale, or actually the illusion of scale. And there's something there that we can say, perhaps, that I think is always fascinating about cartography, and in this case, our digital way of thinking about it, which is error. Error, mistakes, things that don't work against our model or expectation of the model. And I want to give you quite some freedom about this, because each, I think, geographer or practitioner of digital methods has its own version of what this error looks like. And so I'm curious, I can start with you, Kate, if you want.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think when I showed you the David Rumsey results, if any of you have gone onto the website and said, I want to search for my hometown, that's always what people search for first, although I encourage you to search for things that are not place names. That's really fun. I always search when I go to maps, search for restaurant and then go in France and look for historical restaurants in France. It's a good way to then decide where to go eat that night. But I think what happens when you interact with the data in that way is you find the things that are correct, right? You find the findable. What you don't see in those search results is that kind of long tail of really, really terrible results. Now, what's exciting is there is a lot to find, and it's incredibly productive, and we were excited to make this searchable and accessible, and it was the right thing to do. But now what we've got to do is grapple with, well, what really is in this data set, right? Of all this text on maps, how does the error vary by the language that the map is written in, by what century it was printed in, where it was printed, the fonts, the background textures, all of these kinds of elements that impact the quality of either the detection or the recognition of the text on the maps. And this is the kind of thing that we're only kind of starting. The computer scientists working on this are really starting to wrap their head around, like, what are the evaluation metrics that we should be using for these tasks? How are they different for maps than the kind of photographs that Text in the Wild or Scene Text Detection, evaluation metrics that have been created for those tasks are quite similar, but also different. These are the things we're still figuring it out. And I think to come back to Bruce Mao's presentation earlier, and we're like, science is always changing and the humanities are also always changing too, right? Our ideas about the world are always changing, and the access to the data that we have is always changing, and the way that we can interact with it is changing, and our relationship. I love this idea, right? That it's that blue dot that's actually the most impactful thing, right? That we are at the center of the map, and that's such a foreign thing, and yet for people in the last 20 years, it seems really normal. So I think there's just so much to look at there. It's a bit overwhelming, actually, the size of error, the nature of error. How do we grapple with it? How do we understand it? And then what can we do still with the data that we have?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think for us in the kind of the mainstream mapping business, whether it's ourselves or Apple or here or any of the other companies, it's now become much harder to deal with error because we are now all cartographers. We all have that capability. It's become almost an adversarial position now, where we have to fight map spam all of the time. And the great truism in our business is truth is very expensive, fiction is free. And it's very easy, particularly around businesses and local activities, for people to post garbage, often, almost always, with malcontent behind them, saying we want to get another business out, or we want to make a public comment for whatever reason, like it's going to put that on the map. And that has become a real battle for all of the online mapping providers, is dealing with a thing that didn't exist 15 years ago, map spam. So map spam is our biggest problem.
Oh, that's interesting. So it puts also the idea of authority of the map being used as a Trojan horse. That's fascinating. We can go back to that if there's still a bit of time. Sarah, do you have any experience of error on your side, and what does it feel like?
I know that the Google Map reference to the museum that I run, EPFL Pavilions, which is this pavilion for art and science, it had a name change. It was rebranded, right? And it took about a year to get the name changed on Google Maps. And it was a branding disaster, right? Because people couldn't find it on the map. it was so that's my little anecdote there. Eventually it was changed, and of course the visitors flooded through the gates, as they should.
Well, you have my email now, so do feel free to use it.
I will be on your case.
That really brings in, I think, the point on the authority of the map.
Yeah.
Because maybe is that changing as we move through the public and the perception of error changes, or we?
Well, with the David Rumsey data, we made it available. We worked with a bunch of people to create a way for people to edit the data with the idea that they would be validating the results, right? Correcting machine learning detection or transcription errors. However, they can do anything they want. And that was a decision, David Rumsey felt very strongly about that. It's open, people will do what they want, but that his view was that by and large, people will do good. And I think that, we haven't analyzed any of the edits yet, but when we do that, I think I feel confident that will be true. Yeah,
I hope so.
Yeah,
but
I'm optimistic.
But I think this is quite a nice niche audience. The people that are going and having the Rumsey archive are not the same people that we're having to battle against.
That's true.
I hope that's
It's
the
not
same.
Google.
I hope that's the same. But around the authority point, I think it's a really interesting question because I came to Google from Ordnance Survey, the authority in terms of mapping in Great Britain, and now I think it's harder to identify what does authority mean in the online world. It's the same issue with Wikipedia. Is Wikipedia authoritative? Well, it's not bad, and the signals that are used now as an alternative to authority in terms of how referenceable is it? Maybe that's that's where we end up. The most authoritative is the most used.
The market rules then.
Maybe.
You want to add, Sarah? Or?
Just to say that in an interactive system for mass public, it's that the public emergent map that is the map of the day. Yeah, so it's the one that, as I think it goes absolutely to this point, that it's the most used is the winner.
Yeah. Well, on this point about the future mapping as a collective effort that breaks what we knew and creates a brave new world, we can end, I think, this session. But thank you again for these very nice presentations and the conversation.